All right, we're going to get to the South Carolina game and the Georgia Tech one, but we got to get into the perfect college football top 12, David. So what we're going to do, I'm going to tell everybody, the way this works, we give you our top 12. Okay, this is not formatted for the college football playoff with the automatic bids, right? That's why you see two Big Ten teams starting us off with Oregon and Ohio State. Then we're going to give you what it would look like in the college football playoff format, because there's a big glaring difference between the two, not just where teams are, but what teams are in, and I'm going to let David explain that. But if you're on audio, I'm going to read you our top 12 as it stands today. Oregon 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3, Notre Dame 4, Penn State 5, Georgia 6, Tennessee 7, Miami 8, SMU, shout out our boy Rhett Lashley, 9, Indiana 10, Clemson 11, and Arizona State 12. And David, before, and you do such a good job of helping people decipher kind of how we go about it in our methodology. It's amazing. You put out like a top 5 or something a couple weeks ago, and there's so much changing in college football. You put it out on social media, and some people are like, oh, man, this is great analysis, man. Like, the margin for error in this year's rankings, it's never been thinner. And so much can change by just one team losing. And it's made it a lot of fun. But this is the hardest rankings I think we've ever done over a period of time, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and I guess the only option to counter what you're talking about is just every single week for us to make our ranking based off how we think it will end at the end of the season, which would force us right now to have to go ahead and say, oh, you know what, we're going to make sure that we think Texas will beat Texas A&M. That's why they're there, right? Like, we're not going into that. We're just saying, hey, this is week 14. After all the craziness and all the chaos that's just happened, here's our ranking right now. A couple things to point out. Let's start with Notre Dame and Penn State. Penn State gets to make a case, well, we didn't lose to Northern Illinois. Our loss is much better. We lost to the number 2 team in the country at home. But Notre Dame has the case to make that, well, we have the better win going on the road.
What's more beneficial, or what do you care about more, a quality win or an awful loss? We can get into that argument, but they're literally right next to
it. And it doesn't matter that much because Notre Dame can't get a first-round bye because they're not in a conference, right? And that closely together, they're not going to be playing each other, and both would host.
And Penn State's not going to get a bye either. They're not playing in the Big Ten championship game, at least.
No. And then that gets us obviously to Indiana. We touched on it a little bit yesterday. I think it's worth revisiting. At the very end of that Indiana game, I watched it with an Indiana fan. I looked over and I said, I don't think they're going to be in my top 12. He said, I agree. They don't look like a top 12 team. Just a few minutes later, Ole Miss loses. Later that evening, Alabama loses. Arizona State upsets BYU. So all of this stuff was happening in real time, and that means they move up a couple spots. How do you feel right now about Indiana at 10?
Do I think that Indiana is a elite team or one of the best teams in the country? No, I don't. But I think there's a certain way, if you're really trying to put the best ranking together, if you out there believe that Indiana shouldn't make the playoff, okay, you can believe that. If you want to think, hey, if Texas loses to A&M and they got 2 losses with no great wins, they shouldn't make the playoff, okay, that's fine to believe that. But then my follow-up question is, but what about what's happened around them? Because you can't just make a ranking based off, I don't think this team needs to be in the playoff, without having the context of Alabama losing for a 3rd loss, Ole Miss losing for a 3rd loss. Because to me, win-loss record matters. And I'm not going to have a conversation with somebody getting over Indiana if they've got 3 losses and Indiana ends up 11-1. Mm-hmm. I think arguing a 9-3 team should get in over an 11-1 Big Ten team. I'm not even going to listen to that argument because win-loss record matters to me. Now, let's say it was Indiana going up against a 10-2 Alabama team. We can have that argument, buddy. Mm-hmm. We can have the argument of 11-1 versus 10-2 because there's that game difference. I have a cutoff. If it's 2 games or more, a 2-game lead or more in the overall win-loss record, outside of that 3-loss team getting an automatic bid, I'm not going to have that conversation. So, do I think, right, that South Carolina is a better team than Indiana right now? If they played on a neutral field, I would bet all my money on South Carolina. But I'm telling you right now, if Indiana goes 11-1, they're getting in the playoff, and they deserve to get in the playoff because they have 1 loss. Now, we're not talking about Boise State or somebody that automatically gets a bid. We can have that argument. But I'm not going to argue an 11-1 team versus a 9-3 team. We can argue 11-1 versus 10-2 all day. But my biggest point is, for the people out there that just say, Indiana shouldn't make the playoff, or if Texas loses, they shouldn't make the playoff. Okay, you can believe that, but explain to me who should and why they should after the context of a team getting their third loss. Because it's context around them and what that team has done. Those are the two things I put together.
So, Blaine, we talked about, you and I were having a conversation just a week ago and talking about the different point margins for Indiana to lose against the Buckeyes, too, and where would that move them. And here we sit right now. Last week, what was the strength of schedule? Was it 103?
106. It was 106.
After playing the Buckeyes, it's halved. They're in the 50s now, right? And so how do you feel about Indiana at 10 based off
I feel like you have to put them in. You have to put them in. I wonder what their strength of schedule is now.
That's what I'm saying. It's in the 50s.
And
in the 50s.
They need to learn about their strength of schedule. And some of it's just a one minute game. It's one game that can change an absolute number. So,
that's this year, though.
Yeah,
that's this year in college football.
And trust me, I know you said no 3-loss team should get in. You don't want to argue it. Trust me, I'm looking at the chat right now, but you're going to have to. But I think Indiana is, you have to put them in the playoff, because if you don't, then everything almost just falls apart.
Well, if Indiana loses this weekend in Purdue, put that 9. I will put a 9-3 team over a 10-2 team in the playoff. But what's the cutoff? What's the cutoff? Is it? Oh well, look at Kansas.
Auburn.
Yeah, look at Auburn. Well, they're playing better
Florida.
right now. Florida than they have. Why would you not put in a great 8-4 team over an Indiana team that's 11-1? There has to be a cutoff, but you can't have half of it. You can't say Indiana just shouldn't be in the playoff. Now, if South Carolina beats Clemson and Indiana loses, or South Carolina beats Clemson and SMU loses, or South Carolina beats Clemson and Miami loses, I would put South Carolina in over all of them. But the odds of that happening are not great. You can't just forget losses. I don't care who they're to.
What if South Carolina murdered?
It doesn't matter. It depends on what happens around them. Don't lose 3 games.
Yeah, well,
don't lose 3 games.
Not only did you lose 3 games, but now Alabama and Ole Miss are also 9-3. Well, assuming they finish out that way, ceiling is 9-3, and they both have the head-to-head over you. That's what's tough. You almost wanted those teams to stay at 10-2 so that you could possibly be the only 9-3. Can we just put it in bracket form for 1 second so people can see? Because what's interesting is that Clemson at 11 right there, that goes away.
Clemson would be out.
Even though they weren't 12, because the 12th, see right there, was Arizona State for the first time. And in this scenario, they'd be the highest ranked Big 12 team.
There are only Big 12 teams. So
and again, that's where more stuff's going to happen. We're not necessarily telling you right now that we think Arizona State would win the Big 12, but they're the highest ranked Big 12 team we have right now. So in the 4th spot, and then the Buckeyes would get Boise State.
So if you're on audio, the way it would work in the college football bracket, because this is formatted to what the playoff is you would have in order your top 4 seeds: Oregon 1, Texas 2, Miami 3, Arizona State 4. Those would be the top 4 teams. They would get the bye. Then you would have your 5-12 matchup, or your 5 group of 5 versus group of 5 matchup: Ohio State versus Boise, Notre Dame and Indiana. What a battle for the state of Indiana that would be at the 6-11. Penn State hosting SMU, and then Georgia hosting Tennessee. And surprise, surprise, the winner of that gets Oregon. That would be an absolutely incredible. It's going to be incredible either way.
Yeah,
I will
Ohio
say
State,
one thing, Boise State should be a great game.
Oh yeah, Ohio
say
State
one
would
thing.
beat Boise State by 40. They would name their score. I'm sorry, you could have 3 Ashton Genties, it ain't gonna save you.
I will say this: of all the weeks that we've done this, with the potential matchups, as great as the hypotheticals have been, I'm less excited about these possible matchups than I have been in weeks past. And I think that that speaks to some of the SEC fans' frustration. Like, I do want to see Alabama go on the road and play Notre Dame. Like, how great would that be? I do want to see Indiana have to go on the road and play in Knoxville. But in this particular scenario, keep in mind we didn't do it based off what the matchups would be. So we can't help that Georgia and Tennessee have already played once. Again, I'm not panicking about it. There's still a week to go, plus conference championships.
Yeah, so, and I'm sure and we're going to get to the chat in 1 second. I'm sure there's people in the chat that are like, well, South Carolina would be favored by 12 points over Indiana neutral site. Okay, I agree with you. But if that's the only thing you go off of, if that's it, then why even play the season? What are we doing?
Alabama was just favored double-digit points against us.
Yeah, you can't, and that would be thinking that no upsets ever happen. You can't, again, you can be a fan short for fanatical, it's whatever. But win-loss record has to matter, especially, guys, we are talking about a Big Ten team and an SEC team. We are not talking about an SEC team and a Sun Belt team. We are not even talking about an SEC team and a Big 12 or an ACC team. At some point, win-loss record has to go into the formula, along with this team is better than that team, or this team is playing better than the other team right now. Hey, YouTube, look, we're getting close to the playoffs. Stop messing around. Hit subscribe if you hadn't. If not, go be wrong somewhere else.